we're talking holiday baking, and I missed those moist, fluffy dinner rolls. So this is the closest thing that I've found. It's adapted from a recipe by GF Jules, which is its brand of flour that I absolutely love. There's a link to it on my website, jessicanicole.love, and you could buy it directly. It's one, hands down, of the gluten-free flours that I've found has worked the best. And I am not a baker, y'all. So in this bowl, I have all the dry ingredients, and there's a couple interesting ingredients in this recipe for dinner rolls that I've found that most recipes don't have. So I've got your active dry yeast in here, and important if you're doing gluten-free baking, which you probably already know, but you want to make sure that your yeast is gluten-free because not all of them are. So this Red Star active dry yeast is gluten-free. I've got 2 cups, 2.5 cups of the gluten-free flour, baking soda, baking powder, salt, coconut sugar for a little bit of sweetness. And then an interesting ingredient that they add in this recipe that I've found gives it this kind of fluffy texture are organic mashed potato flakes. So I found these on Amazon along with everything else that we buy. But they're just an organic, gluten-free, obviously they're potatoes, dried potato flakes. And this bag is huge. It would last you a while. So keep it stored in a cool, dry place. So once I have all the dry ingredients together, I'm going to put them in my stand mixer. You can also use a hand mixer, but I've just found investing in a stand mixer is really good, even though I don't bake that often. And for this, I'm going to use the paddle attachment. So it happens to be that flat attachment. It's good for dough. So I'm just going to give this a little stir just to make sure that's nice and mixed up. And then we'll add in the wet ingredients. So the other ingredient, which I thought is interesting, is they add carbonated water or sparkling water. So I've got 1.5 cups of that. Let's go ahead and turn that on. They're going to add a teaspoon of apple cider vinegar, 3 tablespoons of olive oil, 1, 2, 3, and then just 1 cracked egg. I always like to crack my egg kind of outside of the dish, make sure that there's nothing kind of funky with it, but I'm going to go ahead and throw that in there. So I'm going to mix that together on low till it's incorporated, and then we're going to turn it up to medium and let that go for about 3 minutes. So that looks pretty well incorporated. We'll go ahead and shut that off. And I've found in gluten-free baking, especially with these yeast rolls, the dough tends to be really sticky. So how we're going to put it in the pan to cook is an interesting little way. All right, so I just have a 9-inch baking dish here. And it calls to put, spray the pan and also put a sheet of parchment paper, but you're like, how do I get it to fit? So this little trick in culinary school, and it actually works. So you turn the pan over, fold your parchment paper in half, and line it up with the halfway point, and then cut all the extra off. I feel like I'm back in preschool. Just cutting out my circle. And it doesn't have to be perfect, but it fits in pretty nicely there. All right, so I'm going to spray the pan with a little bit of coconut oil, spray the parchment, and it just makes it easier for these lovely little rolls to come out when we're ready. All right, so I have my little ice cream scooper. I think this is one of my kids, but it works. And I have hot water here. When I say the dough is really sticky, it is. So I'm going to use this to take a scoop out. And I'm going to dip it in water each and every time. Otherwise, I find that the dough is really sticky. So you can put a little bit of space in between. I kind of cuddle them up together. And I found, there's so many dietary restrictions out there when you're entertaining. And we're gluten and dairy free, so that's kind of where I go to first. And when I have other people over, I just buy the rolls that are full of gluten for them. Know your strengths, and you can't do everything. It's certainly not worth, if you have a gluten-free kitchen, to go and buy a bunch of regular flour, but if that's your thing, by all means. It's all about saving time, and certainly I'm not a huge fan of baking, so 1 batch of dinner rolls is enough for me. All right, so this will make about 10 rolls when we're done. All right, so the next thing, which is kind of interesting, is I'm going to smooth the tops of these before I let the dough rise. So kind of flatten it out. We don't have the luxury of having all of that good gluten that's going to expand and make that kind of light, fluffy, beautiful roll consistency that we love. So this is the closest thing that I've found that comes to it. All right, the flax egg substitute also works really well here. And I'm gonna choose, instead of doing an egg wash for the top, I'm gonna choose to do a little apricot preserves. It's gonna give it a little bit of extra sweetness, and I think it adds a really nice color. So I'm gonna put a little apricot preserves in there. I'm gonna thin it with just a little bit. I'm gonna use that same water. Mix that around. And instead of doing that egg wash, I'm gonna use this and just brush each of the tops of the rolls with this apricot preserve. And then from here, we're gonna let them rise just like a traditional yeast roll. My kitchen tends to be cooler, so I will turn an oven on at 200 degrees and then turn it off. And I'll show you what happens if the dough rises too quickly. But if your house isn't drafty or if it's a normal temperature, you can probably just put it off, cover it with a damp towel. I'm gonna let this rise for 25 minutes. And then I'm gonna bake it in an oven. I'm gonna turn it on at 425 degrees to begin. When I put the rolls in, I'm gonna reduce the temperature to 350 and let them cook the remainder of the time. They cook about 25 minutes. All right, with the magic of video, I have 2 sets of these dinner rolls baked off and ready to go. When I said I wasn't a baker, I meant it. So I set this first batch in an oven that I set at 200 degrees and turned off and didn't let cool, and it rose too quickly. So you notice it has some pretty big kind of air bubbles in here. The taste is still really good. I would probably serve these, again, with a disclaimer, I'm not a baker, and if they don't want to eat them, they don't want to eat them. But this one that I redid, I went ahead and rose really slowly. I actually just put it in a cool oven. It rose fine in about 25 minutes, just covered with a little bit of wax paper, and then bake that off. And you notice that the texture is a little more uniform and even. So these are a really great addition to any Thanksgiving table. So I think all those gluten-free and dairy-free eaters will love to have a hot, buttery dinner roll for your Thanksgiving dinner.